Jeanine, is that how you pronounce your name?
That's how you pronounce it.
Jeanine, it's nice to have you on. Really appreciate you taking the time to have a conversation with me. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself before we get started?
Sure, no problem. So right now I'm a professor in the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies at the University of Toledo. And my specialty is philosophy of religion, and it kind of just grew out of my upbringing. But I also dabble around in general sort of world religion, and I'm interested in religion, violence, and peace. And I wasn't always a philosopher, so I worked for the government for a while and for nonprofits for a while.
I'd be surprised if anyone was always a philosopher. They're just born a philosopher, just baby Socrates.
Yes, that's true.
So the topic today is it necessary for God to be perfect? Could you tell me more about your position on that?
Yeah, so my position is that it's not necessary to be perfect in order to be God. So this actually was my dissertation topic out of the University of Michigan about 20 years ago. And it actually sort of started just by working with my advisor whose main reason for not believing in God was that there are lots of contradictions in the idea of a perfect being. And, we can talk more about what those are, but just to give you a quick example of one of them, and there's I think over 30 extant arguments like this that he was kind of rifling through. So, one of them is this idea that nothing could be both omnipotent and omniscient at the same time, because what it takes to be omniscient is to know everything, but there are some concepts especially things that involve being frustrated or fearful, or things that imply that you can't do everything. Those kind of concepts by experience. And God, if God were omnipotent, you don't even have to talk about God. You can just say an omnipotent being couldn't know those kinds of states, and therefore can't know everything, and therefore can't be omnipotent. So that's just one example of the sorts of puzzles that insisting on God's having all the perfections, which are, I mentioned two of them right there, sorry, without explaining it. So the perfections are any kind of property that makes you better to have it than not to have it. And essentially, they cross all the categories of being. And so if there's the category of power, then you've got to be really powerful. And in fact, if you're going to be perfectly powerful, you're going to have to be every time I say, hey, is this enough power? You're going to say, if you can have more, you got to have it. Because remember, we're looking for perfect power. And so there's this sort of pressure to maximize in the perfection. So you got to have the most you can have, or the most pure version of it. And so you get things like the omnis is what I call them: omnipotence, omniscience, omnibenevolence. You also get sort of the pure sorts of things like impeccability, you have a perfectly pure moral track record. And so anyway, when you maximize these properties, you end up getting these perfections, but you end up producing, I think because they're so rarefied and so sort of sensitive, you end up producing a bunch of conflicts or apparent conflicts between them. And I ended up basically feeling like this was interesting, but that it didn't touch what I meant when I talked about God, that I never had thought of God as a perfect being in the first place. And so I was like, maybe I should just think about how I do think about God. And then it turned out, as I thought about how I do think about God, it didn't require perfection, and thus escaped basically all 30 plus arguments single-handedly.
So what do you mean? What do you think is the minimum requirement for something to qualify as God?
Yes, that's good. So yeah, one of my friends actually, after they read my dissertation, which I had entitled at one point, "What It Takes to Be God," said, "It's a lot less than you think." In other words, I am some people think I'm kind of bottom fishing, but I actually think I'm getting closer to right. So, but here's what I think. So I called this view functional theology. So, and it really did sort of match why. I mean, it was nice. I felt like I was able to articulate why when my advisor talked about the perfect being, I realized I just think of God like this. I think of God as whatever it is, if there is something like this, that does certain things in the universe or even just to create the universe. And so, and some people thought this was kind of not holy enough, but I called these God's jobs. Okay. I didn't mean to assign jobs to God. It might sound like that. But what I was trying to do was to say, if you look across, like what I did was study sort of the text of the tradition for a while, including the Hebrew Bible, the Christian New Testament. For a while, I was going to try to expand this to other theistic religions like Islam. And one of my dissertation committee members is like, holy cow, Jeanine, not Islam too. Let's just stick with Judaism and Christianity. And I'm like, yeah, you're right. Okay, let's. So anyway, so I just was studying the texts of important Jewish and Christian scriptures, as well as theologians such as Augustine, and Aquinas and Maimonides, etc. And what I found was pretty interesting, is that there were actually pretty standard agreement on several jobs, and that there was no disagreement about these jobs, which wasn't true for the perfections. There was disagreement in the text about whether God was perfect in these various ways. And we could go there if you want. But that sort of disagreement was absent about the job. So in a way, I felt like I was glomming on to something that was more deeply true about God than perfect being theology was, at least if you pay attention to the text of the tradition. And it also matched my own take, which is like, I think God's probably pretty unknowable by a human mind if there is the kind of thing we're attempting to talk about. My guess is it would be beyond us. And so this idea that we could sort of define God like we define a triangle just seems crazy to me. Like, so this a priori approach to saying, hey, here's what we mean by God. And once we define God this way, this also entails God's actual nature. I'm like, look, I'm married to my husband for 15 years, and I would never try to define my husband. Like, no way. And I actually think if there is a God, then God is real in the same way my husband would be real. And how could we possibly define it with way less evidence about its nature? Anyway, this is this puzzling thing that I feel like maybe I just don't understand what perfect being theologians are doing when I say this, but essentially that's just been my recoil reaction to it for a while. And so when you think of God as the being that does certain things, and I can name a few of them, it's less puzzling to me because it leaves God's nature open. So that was a little bit quick, but so the jobs that I came up with kind of oddly for me sort of dropped into sort of larger clusters of jobs, which I call tasks. So there's kind of like the easy one is like the personal task, which is I think the one that I grew up with in my church setting, where you're actually attempting to relate to God as someone who, or a thing, whether it's a person or not, can manage to hear or receive your prayers and possibly answer them. You can kind of commune with this being or align with it, or sort of be in touch with it in some way during your day, like your average day. So that's like this personal task. There's a providential task, also something I really grew up with in my Protestant setting, where God was kind of for you. You know what I mean? Like God was going to try to make things better for you and for the people around you as much as possible. And so you get sort of mild interventions, like, things line up easily. Just a super small example of when I was growing up, I was like at a telephone booth, and I can't, this is before there were phones. You guys can tell how old I am. Before there were, the phone was plugged to the wall. Okay. I was in some foreign city and I can't even remember where. And I was like struggling because I was trying to get an address down, and I knew that I wasn't going to be able to memorize both the phone number and the address and the name of this person that I was going to, like, my next step in my journey. Right. So I'm like, and I couldn't find a pen. And I was like starting to get really like, what am I going to do? And then essentially I was like, okay, like I could get frustrated right now, or I could just open myself up and just say, hey, God, I need a pen. So I just did the latter instead of doing the former for once, right? And then, like, essentially, weirdly, within about 5 seconds, a janitor who looked beatific, oddly, came around the corner and said, hey, do you need a pen? So I got a pen. Okay, but so like, I have no idea. And a friend of mine and I are actually going to try to talk this through in the next couple of weeks about whether that's God or just luck. But, there you go. There's a moment that most Christians that I know would interpret as providence. And I just wanted you guys to see that there's no laws of nature that got broken or anything, right? It's just like a happy coincidence, which came after I prayed. Okay. So that's one of the jobs, is that we see God sort of acting. The tradition reads God as acting in that way. And there's stronger providential things, which you might call miracles, and we all know about those. But those are where laws of nature seem to be broken. So that's the second job. First job, we can commune. Second job, you help me out and us out. Third job is like the moral job, which is a complicated one and not my forte. But the idea is there's this weird, I think the Hindus do this really well. There's this weird fact about the world that when you behave morally, things go better for you. So the Hindus obviously call this karma. What I didn't understand until I started studying Hinduism is that they take it to be kind of as real as a law of nature. There's moral laws of nature, essentially, so that if you do this, good thing, then good will come back to you. And if you do this bad thing, bad will come back to you. And as we all know, that doesn't seem to happen reliably in this lifetime, but happily for Hinduism, they have reincarnation. And so even if you don't see it in this life, just wait for life 13 and you'll get paid back. So, but that's this idea that I just explained it in a Hindu, or a very, very basic Hindu worldview, but you could, like George Mabrodi says, there's this weird thing, morality is just this weird queer thing that doesn't really go bump in the night, but is there in the world, and it's weird enough that you need something outside the world to explain it, how you've got, or at least something within the world that is inherently valuable that makes that happen. So that's the moral task, is to somehow sort of explain why there's right and wrong. Clearly evolution can do some of this too, but also why we value what we're calling right and wrong in the first place. So the moral job, that's sort of like, there's also a really, again, these are clusters, the moral task, because there's clusters of jobs that it seems like the tradition takes God to do, that are moral. Obviously, another big one is this kind of redemptive feature, where being aligned with God in the right way creates what Christians call a state of salvation, and Jews might call a state of righteousness. But a higher spiritual state that you reach by being in touch with this being, a higher moral state too. And then there's the cosmological job, which maybe I should have started with, which is this really sort of fundamental. Well, it's a task again, but and you see it in some basic arguments like the design argument or the cosmological argument for the existence of God. It's just the idea that God is the metaphysical bedrock that created everything else. And then really there's this other job, maybe two other jobs, depending on how I want to write this up. But One of them is just called a transcendental job or task, which is, again, there's this cluster of things. But I think it might actually fall out from the other tasks I just described. But the idea is that it's whatever God is, it's inspiring worship and awe. And you might imagine that if somehow you met up against something that created everything that there is and is moral, very deeply created the whole idea of what's good or goodness, and also cares about us and tries to help us, you might end up being inspired to worship it. And I guess, so there's a whole nest of issues about worship. One of my favorite lines that somebody said is, why would God want to be nudged so much? Right? That seems kind of actually immoral or narcissistic or something. And there's some interesting work on that. But I tend to read worship as more just a trace of a very human reaction to something beyond the beyond. So, like, I think when you see Isaiah, you see it that way. Hey, people are talking to us. I didn't even realize that. That's really cool. Okay.
Ignore the chat. They're very mean. Ignore them.
That's okay. No, it's totally. So you guys, I'm actually just trying to describe what the tradition says. I know it may sound like this is stuff I believe, and I believe some of it, but we can go there later if you want to.
Well, is this the minimum criterion for what any kind of God would qualify as, or specifically the kind of thing you refer to when you talk about God?
Okay, well,
because like a deistic God, I would say that there could be a deistic kind of a God who created the universe, could ground morality, but doesn't have the worship side, like when you try to have commune with him or something along those lines.
Awesome. Yeah, you got it. So what I'm trying to do is show you the sort of full bevy of stuff that's out there and owned by people in the tradition. And what I mean by the tradition is Jewish and Christian tradition. So this is God with a capital G, no little g's. Okay, so it's the single God, trying to describe the single God that people within those traditions who own or feel responsible to the text that I looked at, the Hebrew Bible and these thinkers, it's that God. Now notice that isn't the deist God. At least if I had added Thomas Jefferson in and deleted the other guys, then maybe we would have been analyzing the deist God. What I have here is kind of, you could do the deist, like you could read the deists and then look for the jobs there and identify the deist God by its jobs if you wanted to. You could do this for any religious tradition, but I was just focusing on Christianity and Judaism because of my advisor. And really my own, what brought me to the project was my own Christian upbringing. So, but yeah, I don't know if that helps. Is that answering your question?
Yeah, for sure. So my next question would be is like, since the God doesn't need to be omni-powerful or whatever, how powerful does he need to be in particular?
Nice.
Like,
yeah.
could the Mormonism idea of a God is something like just a highly evolved being it wasn't the originator of all of the stuff. It just existed like we do, but just developed enough technology to be able to act as if it's a God, more or less. And so would that kind of a thing qualify as a true God in that sense? Could it have been created by some other God or something else? Could it have been not the only one?
Great questions. So one of the advantages of this view, and I think you're catching it, is that, so for a while, people were like, hey, Jeanine, I think you're just describing the same God. Like the functional God that you just described is a perfect being. And I'm like, no, because that's precisely why I love this view. This view is pretty quiet about the nature of the thing that does the jobs. And so the prime example I use in functionalism and philosophy of mind, this is called a functional concept. So I'm doing the same thing that philosophy of mind does for mental states, for God. So, but in philosophy of mind, the key example is a carburetor. So a carburetor is a functional concept in this sense. It doesn't tell you what the carburetor is necessarily composed of or made of. It doesn't tell you about the stuff, right? It's a function. What makes something a carburetor is that it mixes air and gas and sends it out for ignition. End of story, right? Turns out, here's the cool thing to pay attention to, that when you have a functional concept, it constrains the nature that is equipped to do the function. So not just anything can be a carburetor, like steam can't be a carburetor, right? But steel could be a carburetor, or you could have like mixed alloys that might be less reliable at high pressures or high temperatures, but that could still carburate under certain conditions, right? One of my friends, an engineer, was like, you could even make a room into a carburetor if you just put some gas and air in there and then had a fan that sent it out somewhere, So like the idea is it's sort of multiple realizability of the function. And so to me, that is, how I said, I don't think we could even know. I mean, I don't know what makes my husband tick. How could I know what makes God do God stuff? So that's the impulse here, is sort of like, all I can see are these functions that are happening. Lord knows, maybe Lord does know, where they, what nature is equipping the being who's doing those jobs to do them. See what I mean? So the idea is, look, maybe there is a perfect being that's doing these jobs, but you wouldn't have to be perfect to do these jobs, because all you got to be able to do is these jobs. So anything that falls outside this task list that I just put isn't something God has to be able to do if we're going to use the jobs to define, or notice I'm not really defining God. The fancy term in philosophy is I'm just fixing the referent. Because to define something is to know what it is you're talking about. And I'm precisely not doing that. I'm just trying to talk about the thing that the text seemed to me to be talking about, which is like, there's something that created the world, and there's something that meets us in religious experience, and there's like these jobs are happening, and there's one thing doing it, but it could be perfect, but it could be less than perfect. It might not be able to make, so it made this universe. Maybe there's a whole multiverse. I don't know, but whatever there is, that's all. We don't have to have like 15 times more multiverses or whatever that we actually have. God doesn't have to be able to do that. God just has to be able to do what there is. You see what I mean? And so you're right when you said that. You're like, well, then you don't have to be omnipotent. And you're exactly right. I don't think you do. I don't think you have to be omniscient. Maybe there's something you don't have to know to do the jobs. Maybe I don't have to know, maybe God doesn't have to know what you had for breakfast this morning. I don't know, in order to judge you fairly at the end of time, or, whatever, in order to start the world off like in a deist way, or, so it's an open and interesting question, what it takes to do the jobs, but it can be less than perfection.
Could it be like a contingent being? So say something that was created by some other thing. Could that, 'cause
Yeah.
I could imagine that this entire universe was like in the Matrix. We're a product of the Matrix, and some guy named Bob programmed this particular universe,
Yes.
came it into existence. Like, all right, I'm going to write morality. Here it
Right.
is. You can pray to
Right.
me, send some like prayers to my inbox. I'll respond to some of them.
Nice.
Here's your keys to that guy.
Exactly.
But
Or
he
yes.
himself is no
Yeah.
more like than a human than we are in any sense, but he
Yeah.
could still potentially act as all of these different jobs for our particular universe.
Right. Yes. So you're getting into the weeds that I was getting into at the end of my paper by the same name. Being perfect is not necessary for being God. And I don't know if you've read or heard about Nick Bostrom. Probably you have, because it seems like you know everything.
I like his dragon, the black dragon that kills 10,000 people a day. That one's a really fun argument that he made.
Oh gosh, I don't know that one.
It's the one that says, if we were in a society where there was a black dragon that killed 10,000 people every day and we just got used to it, and it was like we thought it was invincible, we could never overthrow it. And this is an analogy to try and say this is what we see as death right now, aging and dying of old age, because 10,000 people die every day from old age. And once we get to the point where we can overturn that, we'll start to see it as really like an enemy. We won't be as complacent about it. And so that was one of the favorite arguments he's made that I really like.
Wow, that's interesting. Well, so the one I was just referencing is the one that is, if you look at the nature of the human experience, it seems, and our current sort of move to technology, he gave it a 25% chance that that it's artificial all the way down. Mm-hmm. Did you read this? Yeah. And on that view, people are like, oh my gosh, so the being that made the universe, or, the zeros and ones that create our experience, could just be like a teenage god or something, like, like what you're saying, like maybe this being is, we got a kind of medium mixed world because our creator was kind of medium and mixed. And yeah, and then there's the open questions like, well, where did our creator come from? Which is your question about, is possibly our God contingent on some other deeper metaphysical rock bottom? So I don't know. I spent like a month or two trying to figure that out, and puzzled over it, and it was painful. So what I came up with was, and I'm a little bit of two minds about this. I mean, I published it one way, but Lord knows that was because it was Tuesday, and maybe on Thursday I would have said something different. I don't know. But if that is the picture, like if there's sort of a God two that made our God one, which made this world and does the jobs in it, and then maybe that God two has a God three, and perhaps this goes back and back. Then either it goes on infinitely or it stops somewhere. And this is Leibniz in me, okay? Either way, I'm kind of a big fan, I'm sure you're not, of the principle of sufficient reason. I guess because we use it all the time. And I don't think this is a knockdown, drag out argument, but my hunch is that the universe scales up or down, or whatever you'd want to call it. That the way things work around me seems to be kind of a clue to the way things work in general. Not always, or whatever. Again, this is not a knockdown, drag out argument, but I think that's why I'm kind of a fan of saying, okay, well, even if it goes on forever and there's tons of gods, or it stops, either way, it requires an explanation. And the great explainer, whatever it is that explains all of that, would definitely be doing the cosmological job at a minimum, by definition.
Yeah. So
and it might do the transcendental job. So I guess what I'm saying is, maybe there's going to be a conflict on our task, like in the way that I sort out what does it take to be God. You have to do. I'm sorry I didn't say this. You don't have to do every job exactly as stated. There's slack in the job description, because that's how I think language actually works. All I'm trying to do is describe a way of seeing what the concept is in Judaism and Christianity. But language is so messy that, like, if you dropped a job here or there, I would still call it God if you did everything, but you didn't help me at the telephone booth, right? Like, if that was just luck, and that's what it always is, then the providential job doesn't happen. But all the other jobs, if you're doing all the other jobs and I'm actually communing with you, and maybe you're going to redeem me or sort of help me become the best me, or whatever that moral piece is, and maybe you created everything there is, and maybe, all those other things are happening, I would go, okay, like, if there's nothing doing more jobs than you, and you do all of those really crucial jobs, I'm going to call you God. So I guess what I'm saying is, when you have slack in the job description, in this harder situation that you're rightly raising about, hey, we might just have God number one in a long string, who's really God? I'm going to say, well, we're going to have to figure that out, because God number one, presumably, at least in our little picture, is doing all the jobs, but not really doing the cosmological job, because isn't the most fundamental thing, right? Maybe a little bit less worthy of worship in light of that than we thought. because it's not the most fundamental thing. You know what I mean? And if the most fundamental thing actually created the conditions for like morality or goodness or something, maybe also not doing that one. And so now we've got like something that's like maybe being personal and providential to us, like is right here for us, maybe not doing it as well as we would hope. But you know, there, and then there's like this other really, really fundamental thing that we can't even touch because it's like way beyond us. Which one's God? Maybe kind of both. And this is where I sort of think there's that God could be a vague term where you might go, oh, this one's pretty goddish and that one's more fundamentally goddish. And I'm saying that in virtue of they're doing the jobs in different ways.
Would it be possible, like possible world semantics? There's multiple different possible worlds. So could there be multiple different kinds of gods that are each the fundamental essence of that reality? And so it creates everything in that reality. But there are also other realities with other gods. Would that, and suppose in our universe, there's the Christian God, and in these other universes, there's just different variations of gods, different personalities, Hindu God or whatever. Would that be possible? And would you still define that as God, even though there's a multitude of necessary beings that all exist in different possible worlds?
So do you think all the possible worlds are real? Are you pulling a
No,
David
I'm
Lewis
not
on
a
me?
modal ontic realist. No.
Okay, I know. I never really understood that. But I mean, I just can't get my mind around it. I'm not saying it's wrong or right. I'm just like, what?
There is a world with a
So,
giant blue potato in my hand right now. It actually
wow.
exists.
It's such a crazy, wild thought. So anyway, um, okay, so you and I are on the same wavelength that these possible worlds are not actual, right?
Yep.
Okay. And so your question is just, could there be lots of different ways the fundamental, like if what we're going to use is the cosmological job to kind of ground the notion of God using the divine jobs? Is that what you're doing here? And then you're
Well,
saying, hey, we
it's
can glom on different properties to that sort of thing that creates the world that it's in? Is that
more
where you're
like,
headed?
would it be possible for there to be multiple possible worlds? So like take modal ontic realism, not say literally all of them exist, but say
Oh,
there's several. There's several of these possible worlds that exist. And there's different gods in each one. Would each of them still qualify as being able to do all of the jobs that you're proposing and still qualify as gods based off of the criterion you've provided, or would they fail to meet the cosmological criterion because they didn't create literally everything else?
right. So are you thinking about multiverse?
Sort of, yeah. It was different gods though, multiverse of gods.
Yeah, right, right. I mean, each universe in the multiverse would have its own God, right?
Mhm.
Which is kind of like what we were just talking about. And there, I think the same reply stands then, is there would be a reason to call the God of each universe in the multiverse or in the multiple possible worlds that are somehow under discussion. Those would be, those would have a right to be called God in virtue of doing the jobs for that particular universe, but they aren't the bottom line because something, presumably, at least in the way that I'm thinking, because I'm a Leibnizian person, you know, is behind the existence of the whole schmear of worlds you're discussing, in which case it lays claim to being a more fundamental divine job doer, possibly. Although it's just not going to be able to do the fun ones because it's too remote from us to, you know, do any providential work, and it's too remote from us to do any personal work, and probably isn't going to redeem us either because it's too remote. So, and it could turn out that that's the way things are. I mean, so this is kind of the way Platonic thought understands God as the one that's way back, right? The most fundamental thing, and that it emanates lesser gods that can do the dirty work of acting in the world. And I'm calling it dirty work on purpose because that's how they see it. Like, ooh, you're going to like deal with all that sort of like temporary stuff. I'm not into that. I'm too, you know, awesome for that. And so there's a way in which, and I never really understood how the distancing and the causal chain is supposed to keep them not dirty, because that to me isn't how causal chains work, but that was what they were going for. And again, me puzzling and scratching my head in the background, not sure that they're achieving what they're hoping for by distancing the fundamental God that way. But all I can say is in the Jewish and Christian tradition as traditionally read, it's all the same God that is doing the fundamental act of creation of everything that there is and dirtying his hands by helping us out. So that's the view under discussion, at least in my reading of these traditions. Again, I don't think it entails perfection. And that's where a lot of, let's just say my view is not super popular.
I feel that's true of most Christians. Like, if you want to know what's wrong with the First Baptist Church, ask the Second Baptist Church, essentially.
Yeah, exactly.
But
one of my friends is like, oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
Go ahead. I was just going to say one of my, you go.
Well, I was thinking that if we think about God in the Bible, he does many things deliberately. He has feelings, he hardens Pharaoh's heart. So it seems like his conscious state is somehow in space and time, or relates to space and time in some way, or relates to logic in some way, or math, and he can be represented by these systems. And so it seems like if that is the case, that he is in time and subject to the laws of logic, then there must be something more fundamental than the conscious God thing, namely this Platonic object of logic and math, as you mentioned before, which I think was the impetus for the whole Thomistic idea that God is pure aseity, whatever that means. And so if God does have these intentional states as described in Judaism and Christianity, can't that be used as an argument to show that there must be something more fundamental, like this Platonic abstract, which governs God in some way, or that time and space has to be more fundamental for his consciousness to exist and interact in some kind of way, and therefore he's not the fundamental thingy that, or that job. He doesn't fulfill that job of being the fundamental thingy.
Right. Nice. So, I mean, first of all, you're grasping. So there's a history to the fact that Jews and Christians have come to think of God as both this fundamental thing and doing the divine jobs, other divine jobs that are more personal, which is the meeting of Jews and Greeks under Alexander the Great. So basically, you have Jews who think of God largely functionally, in my view, meeting Greeks who think of God largely as this impersonal, perfect thing that may somehow be ordering the world. That's how Plato sees it. Or Aristotle has this beautiful image of, may somehow be the first mover image of, like, think of a wheel that, is spinning. Think of the center of that wheel. The center of that wheel that's making it spin is the first mover. But, famously not interactive with the world that's spinning, doesn't even know necessarily that it's existing, because Aristotle thinks of God as thinking on his own thinking, which may not involve anything about what anyone else is experiencing. So anyway, yeah, the tensions between these two views are pretty strong and long, and they combined slowly over about 300 or 400 years, until pretty unmistakably at the time of Philo, who was a learned Jew in Alexandria, who didn't even really speak Jewish, Hebrew. Sorry, I can't believe I missed that.
He didn't speak Jewish.
I know. I was like, oh my gosh. Sorry about that. But yeah, he didn't speak Hebrew, and was really well trained in philosophy, and attempted to try to sort out how a being could be both what the scriptures told him and what the Greek philosophers told him, and ended up writing really convoluted sort of explanations of how that might work. And I don't even know if convoluted is the right word, because they were almost incomprehensible when I read them. Like, wasn't even sure what he meant after reading it multiple times. And so you might think that would have dissuaded others from continuing combining these two ideas, but in fact, by the time of Augustine in 400 CE, it became anathema to say anything except that God is a perfect being who does these jobs, oddly. And so we end up with this kind of really, these ongoing tensions between being able to do this deep fundamental cosmological task and do the personal tasks that are described in the Bible. And they're even to this very day being sort of tamped down. I mean, you have like open theists working on this, and people like Walter Storff, trying to explain how God could suffer and still be, unchanging in an important sense, still working on the tensions, which is enough to make me think that maybe if there is anyone doing all these jobs, they might not be perfect, because we've been trying to show that those two things go together for 2,000 years and coming up dry.
So what is your take on the moral job? Because when I look at morality as things progress, it seems like morality changes across time. I'm a moral realist. I think that there is objective morality. And when I
Okay.
look at moral progress, it seems like there's a consistent change to morality across time, and that people's interpretation of the Bible tends to change at the same ways, or in the same ways as the cultural change of morality. So, like right now, we see progressive Christianity being more open to LGBTQ. We saw Christianity go from supporting slavery to abolishing slavery. We see all the different women's rights, all the different progressions we see in human culture of advocating for morality seem to be retroactively interpreted into the Bible. They seem to find quotes that justify those things as the change occurs. What would that fact tell us about the moral job of the being who designed this?
Yeah, good. Your original question is really about the scriptures. Is that right?
I think it's like, since you said originally that you're trying to describe the God as described by Judaism and Christianity, so the scriptures would be a part of that.
Right.
And
Okay.
if we look at the scriptures and see that the way people interpret the scriptures changes to mirror
Yeah.
their own moral culture in some way,
Right. Yep. Good. Okay. So
how
yeah.
does that impact the moral character of the God?
Right. So I'm not sure if this is implicit, but I think of the scriptures as for a time and a place, at least in certain aspects of it, and that the moral code, say in the Hebrew Bible, was actually in advance at that time and place, urging humanity forward a little bit. So it used to be like, and plus, as you know, any parts of the Bible's really more of a library than a book, because all the parts are written at different times by different authors. So the earlier parts, like the first 5 books, for example, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, was actually a little bit ahead of its time. From what I understood, that was not actually something, say, like somebody with great power was allowed to just kill somebody for stealing bread, right? So that sort of thing was in advance for its time. The golden rule that you see in Leviticus, and then is really brought forward again by Jesus in the New Testament, according to Elizabeth Anderson, I don't know if you know her, out of the University of Michigan, where I was in school. That's how I came to know her. She's an ethicist and also kind of a social contractarian. But she thinks, I just thought this was interesting. She told me she thought that the Golden Rule was also ahead of its time for that time period. She also believes, and I think she's right, and I think you might be implying this, that there's moral progress. I should hope so. We make progress in all fields. Why can't we make progress in morality? So I think, and this is anathema for some, but I think to take the moral tenets in any scriptural text and freeze them is to freeze morality at a period of time. That was never something God would have intended, in my view, if there were a God. God would hope that we would learn even more, but that the way we got there was by listening at the time that those words were given to those words to move a little bit forward. Does that answer your question? Or?
I think so. So there's two parts there. One, I think the golden rule, as far as I know, the oldest version comes from like Hinduism. Hinduism had, I think, a better version, the golden rule. But I am curious to think that if there was a God who acted as the grounds of morality and did write a book trying to express truths about the universe, I would expect it to get to like express morality in a very simple way. Like I think objective morality is any involuntary imposition of will is immoral. That's what I think is the core of morality.
Wait, slow that down. Any involuntary imposition of
will.
Will. Of your will.
Anybody's
or
will.
One's will against another's will.
Yeah, or any will. And not just of one will against another will, anything on any will. So like if a rock falls on you without consent, I think that's immoral. Very strange view of morality. But yeah, so I think
okay, we could go there, but we don't have to. Okay.
Well, so I think the perfect world would be one where it would be impossible for anyone or anything to force any will to do anything they don't consent to doing. If that was just like a law of physics, you have the perfect universe. That would be my view. But I would expect to see something like that in a document written by an all-powerful being who grounded morality. And not seeing that seems to imply that whatever is doing the job of grounding morality would probably be different than whatever's doing the job of writing the textual books of representation of God.
Well, okay, so that's another point on which I differ from a lot of people. But I mean, I take these books to be a human record of intense experience, of what people take to be intense experience of divine interactions. And so I don't take them to be infallible records. I take there to be human traces in the books, and that I always think of it kind of like a treasure hunt when I'm reading them. Like God probably got through somehow, if there were a God. Where? And you're right that the way I'm going to read the where is going to be based on a much more advanced understanding of morality and science than there was back in the day. Why do I keep reading it? I guess because I keep finding treasures. So, but, I also read across traditions, and this is another way in which I'm a little bit different, is I suspect that if there is some fundamental thing being out there that created everything there is, and it's trying to, lure us forward into being better people and, trying to help us find our deepest happiness, then it's not just the God of a single tradition. It's almost certainly trying to reach out across the world and across time. And the way that gets expressed culturally is all the religions that we have. And so there's treasure hunts all over the world. And if there's other intelligent creatures on other planets and other multiverses, there's treasure hunts universally going on to try to connect with this thing doing the jobs.
Do you think there are any consequences to how most people interpret Christianity and Judaism if they're wrong about the idea that God is perfect? Like, how would that change or impact faith in general or religions in general? And what is the significance of whether or not God is perfect?
Well, philosophically, it's pretty huge. I think, to me, there's several important reasons not to believe that there's a God, but on that list, there's the problem of evil, which is almost always, not always, but almost always used with the implication of a perfect being. And it makes that problem much more difficult if there's a perfect being on hand. I think it still probably arises for a divine job doer. But every time there's wiggle room, there's more ways to wiggle out. and the divine job doer has a lot more wiggle room. Nobody's read my work enough to even really, try it out. I think I haven't applied it to the problem of suffering myself. I've always found that problem to be the toughest. But there's this whole problem that I've kind of been gesturing at, which are these conflict arguments, which I call the argument from incoherence. But it's a reason to think that, not only does God conflict with the existence of suffering in the world, you don't even need to add the suffering in the world part, because the whole idea of God is internally inconsistent, which is the one that I was hearing in graduate school, and that's the one that this resolves. So I think it's a boon for theists to think of God this way. I think it helps their cause to think of God this way. That's the practical pay dirt, at least
This way,
philosophically.
as in the perfect way or the non-perfect way?
Oh, I'm sorry, the divine job doer way. I'm sorry. It helps solve the problem. Well, it doesn't solve it, but it sort of give more avenues for reply to the problem of suffering. And I think it actually solves the argument from incoherence. Is that answering what you're saying, or were you asking something different?
No, I think that's right. So yeah, I was asking what are the
Okay.
advantages of the different roles, and because I think that most Christians want to think of God as in the perfect being way, and if God isn't the perfect being way, then they'll say something like, "Oh, well, that's not the God I'm talking about," or something. I get that all the time from religious
Right.
people, Thomists, and so if your
Yeah.
interpretation is correct, would that mean that the God they believe in doesn't exist in any context? And
Well, not necessarily, because like I said, it would be consistent with my view that there could be a divine job doer. I mean, a divine job doer that's perfect. It's one of the underlying natures that could do all the jobs. It's just kind of like more than you need, I think. I mean, you could get by with less. And it turns out if you can solve some other philosophical problems by getting by with less than the perfections. But they could be right, and I wouldn't be wrong if they were right. I would just be like, oh, well, so that's the nature that's doing the jobs. Not what I expected, given all the suffering in the world and all the apparent inconsistencies in that kind of idea of God. But who knew? Maybe you guys were right all along, and I was, wrong to hope that maybe, or to think that maybe we need to get by with less.
but don't they go further than they say that it's logically impossible for God to be anything less than this perfect being thing?
I haven't heard that, but they do say it's conceptually necessary. But that's only to say, hey, we do define God this way. God is by definition a perfect being. And all I'm saying is, the reason you're saying that, there's a historical little story I can tell you where that came from. And I don't know about you, but I'm not inclined to think that history always sends us in the right direction. And there's a lot of evidence that it sent us in the wrong direction by thinking that way. And that evidence is the problem of suffering and the argument from incoherence that you guys are still trying to solve. So I'm out. I'm going to think of this in a different way. And you can follow me or not follow me, but and you could be right, but I don't see reason to think you are. In fact, I see reason to think you're not. And so I'm going to have to think of God in a different way if I'm going to still care about God. But really, that different way is kind of the way that I always thought about God in the first place, even though I didn't have the words. So I'm not like changing my game. I'm just naming my game.
Gotcha. And I do have a question, like, based on your interpretation, how would you interpret things that happen in the Bible, since you said it's more of like a historical recollection of spiritual experiences? Do you take it literally in certain instances? Like, did Jesus rise from the dead? Was the world global flood? Did that happen? Those kind of things, or are those more figurative?
I think I would take that, on a case by case basis. I mean, actually, I think the resurrection of Jesus is pretty darn fundamental to being a Christian, way more fundamental than the Red Sea or Noah's Ark or whatever. So, I mean, I think they all make me go, I wonder if that actually in some way happened. Like, I always think of them as fish tales, right? Like, the fish got bigger and bigger the longer we told the story. So I don't know what the nub might have been that might be true that got passed down through the game of telephone and became a miracle. In Jesus's case, like, again, I don't know, but I know this sounds crazy. I have more trouble with the ascension than the resurrection, which sounds really insane. But like, I mean, I have a lot of trouble with the resurrection, but I can kind of go, okay, look, I mean, so I'm kind of a naturalist, and it sounded like maybe you are too, just from a little that I heard about you. But so I kind of read miracles as naturalistic experiences of things that are really rare, that are kind of instantiating laws we don't know because they're so rare. So the way we reach laws is by just, constant conjunction over and over again. We're like, hey, looks like when you have a match with sulfur on it, fire happens. So, there's this, I'm not a scientist, so I'm not great at this, but I know essentially Hempel describes them as if then. If you do this, then this happens. And you see that if then enough, if then, if then, if then, and you've got a law of nature because it's an unbroken connection between these two things, an if clause and a then clause. So, but if there's rare things, we have less if then, if then, if then to go on. So like when I read say Jesus's miracles in the New Testament, I'm always struck by the fact that Jesus says, it's your faith that healed you. And I'm like, hey, I mean, he's a self-effacing kind of guy, maybe, and maybe would just be trying to take the attention off, maybe. But to me, that's a signal that there might be certain kinds of faith states, which again, we can get into what faith is, but I think it's kind of deep hope states that are psychological states that are hard to get to, that Jesus was somehow able to inspire, and maybe other people have too over time. And maybe that's the if condition is so rare but when it's met, it actually produces the result that the person who's in this intense faith state about that thing it produces that thing in them, possibly. So this is my reply to Hume on miracles, because Hume is basically like, you know why you can't believe in miracles? And he never really says they don't happen. It's just like, you just can't ever believe a miracle account because it's going to be a violation of the law of nature, right? And so all the reasons that I just said, the if-thens, 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 just stack up, and you have all this reason to not believe that thing occurred because it doesn't happen, right? But what he stacked up is all these occasions where possibly this special other condition is not met. I actually think this is how scientific progress works, is we have an idea of a law, and then we have to finesse it because it fails to meet a certain condition. So we move from Newton's idea of gravity to Einstein's idea of gravity because of things that are far from the surface of the earth that Newton wasn't even looking at, right? Mm-hmm. So you have to expand your understanding when faced with new examples. I think that what's happened, for better and for worse, I think, is that people in the miracle cases, like these faith state cases, maybe we could figure out what that special sort of new thing might be, but everybody poo-poos it so much that we just think, I think it's sort of possible that it could naturally happen. I have a friend, Richard Mann, out of University of Michigan Psych Department, who's done some research that's kind of on these more edgy areas, and it's interesting work. I haven't studied it long enough. I haven't worked on this stuff enough to know. But if you're going to ask me about the resurrection, I'm like, well, I mean, that would be a pretty enormous special state, but I'm not ruling out that maybe it could happen. What seems more dicey to me is that then, let's say we can work our way into believing in the resurrection. Then I'm like, okay, you better do something pretty good because you resurrected from the dead, right? But what you're going to do is just to appear to the people that love you, and then you're going to ascend. I don't get that part. You're going to disappear after all this work. Does that really make sense? So anyway, that's what I'm saying is I kind of get that, maybe there's a way to get the resurrection, but the ascension, just don't get it. Just don't understand it.
That makes sense. Yeah. As an atheist, I have lots of intuitive challenges to why I don't believe that it makes sense, but different topic.
Yeah, no, I can hear you.
There are some questions from the audience if you have time, but I do want to be respectful of your time. We have going for about an hour.
Okay. I can take 5 more minutes. Thank you.
Cool. Subby asks if you have been influenced by Carl Jung.
No, although I always feel like I should be. People tell me that I'm kind of like him, that there's something about my work. I'm sorry, I don't know enough about Jung. Oh. Can you tell me why you asked that question? Or is that, we don't do that back and forth?
Well, if he's still in the audience and posts another question, I can see it, but I have no idea. Like, I don't have a direct line to him. I have a direct line to like 80 people or so who are spamming the chat, so I have to like find it. It's more difficult.
That's fine. Okay.
Tim asks, is risk a requirement for experiencing time? I think that's going back to your conversation about how God can't know everything because that would entail knowing certain things that entail limitations, like knowing what it's like to fear or whatever. And so in this case, risk would be a similar kind of a limitation, that if God's omnipotent or omniscient, he can't experience risk.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, that's probably true. I hadn't really thought about that. You don't have to worry like that you're risking your life doing something, because you can always just obliterate whatever it is you're worried about. Yeah,
you can't like gamble because you know what's going to happen. So like, I want $50 on black. Like,
the game's too easy. It's no fun anymore. Yeah, got it. Yeah, that seems right. Okay.
Benjamin Thomas Blodgett asks, what's the best way you could do a test that would change your confidence in what you believe?
In what I believe about the nature of God? Is that the question?
I think so, yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, so my view has been tested a lot in terms of a lot of objections that I've received to it that I've tried to reply to. But I'd love more tests if you guys want to supply some. Gotcha. Is that answering the question, or I'm sorry?
I think he's asking specifically what could falsify your position. How could you falsify your belief and say, if my belief is not the case, here's what we'd expect to see, or something.
Oh, I see. Does that work for conceptual things? Like, so I'm only making a conceptual claim. I mean, I'm not stating anything about the way things actually are. So I'm not sure that falsifiability tests work. I mean, I guess.
Oh, did I freeze? Oh, I think she froze. You guys in the chat still hear me, see me? Is everything still working? Me, you're okay. Sometimes that's happened in like my computer froze because of like updates and stuff, because Windows is dumb and I don't like Windows updates. But that was the end of the conversation anyway, so it's fine. Thanks, guys, for coming. Appreciate it. Please send me super chats. I need the monies. I'm going to go take a nap. I'll see you guys later. Which Rob Coons video was the most intellectually testing? Well, the first conversation I had with him, I didn't know much about his ideology, so I guess that one would be the most challenging. And then the second one is the one where I had actually understood his position and was able to respond in a more coherent way. So I'd say that one. I mean, both are about the same. The second one, I knew how to respond better than the first one because I had more practice. But anyway, I'm going to go take a nap, guys.